At the age of 40, my husband abandoned our perfect family, insisted on divorcing me, and went to reunite with his first love. He said life only happens once, and he had regretted it for over a decade. Now, he wanted to make it up to her. I clenched the report in my hand and didn't say anything. He didn't know he had cancer, and only had a few days to live. At the KTV, Edward cried. Singing, he choked up. The big bosses there teased him, calling him a passionate man at the age of 40. Some joked that Edward truly loved me, buying me the best of everything and still feeling indebted. Love means feeling indebted no matter how much you give, but I couldn't find it in myself to laugh. Because he didn't know the person he felt guilty towards his whole life wasn't me. 2 weeks ago, I saw his long-lost first love. Over the years, she had been married and divorced, leading a difficult life. Now, with her child, she returned to the city and worked in a restaurant serving tea. When she saw Edward and me, she panicked, covering her face and approaching us to refill our water. She smiled nervously, her weathered face showing fine lines and dark spots. Edward hardly recognized her. Judy, he said, puzzled. At that moment, he was just surprised. Judy bit her lip, resigned and finally smiled. It's me, long time no see. Everything changed with that gaze. Edward got lost in her eyes, a bit dazed. Judy glanced at me. Is this your lover? He looks so young, unlike me. You probably wouldn't recognize me now. Edward snapped out of it, holding the teacup, nervous and awkward. Not true. How about you? I got a divorce. Couldn't stay there any longer, she said, avoiding eye contact, but still looking elegant from the side. Edward felt awkward. Don't pity me. Honestly, I'm content. I have a daughter, and we rely on each other. Life's not bad, he said. Well, enjoy your meal. Press the bell if you need anything. She left gracefully, her back straight, like a fragile white flower hiding its weakness. Edward kept staring until he remembered I was still there. He said she was an old classmate he unexpectedly met there. He seemed anxious, glancing back again, but I didn't let on. He didn't know I knew Judy. I had already investigated him thoroughly before we got together, but I cared more about his abilities. His long-lost first love was inconsequential to me. I never thought that the needle I overlooked in my 20s would suddenly stab me in my 40s. When we got home, Edward was a bit drunk. The driver helped him into the car, and he sat down, groaning softly and holding his stomach. Is it hurting again? I told you not to drink so much, I said. He shook his head. It's not because of that. Just an old problem. He didn't want to talk to me much, checked his phone with no new messages, and then laid down to sleep, holding his stomach. There seemed to be an invisible barrier between us since he saw Judy. I was a bit frustrated, but with no solid evidence, I couldn't confront him. So, I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. In a daze, memories of when I first met Edward flooded back. He was poor but ambitious, working tirelessly at the company's lowest level like an ant, tireless and energetic. My father liked him, recognizing his strength and determination, foreseeing his success. And then, he promoted him, introduced me to him, and arranged our marriage. Edward lived up to my father's expectations. After moving up to the decision-making level, he contributed greatly to the company's development. People used to mock him behind his back, calling him a gold digger, but now they respected him. He was decisive at work, but completely devoted to me. I taught at a university, far from the city, early mornings, late nights. He picked me up every day, rain or shine, and my colleagues envied me for marrying such a good man. But Edward said the lucky one was him. Without me and my father, he would have never succeeded. 5 years into our marriage, while the global financial crisis hit, my father's company went bankrupt overnight, leaving behind millions in debt. With his health declining, my father died of a sudden illness. Edward took care of my father's affairs, sought funding, and spent years paying off the debt. Those were tough times. We mortgaged our house, moved into my grandfather's old place, and lived frugally. One day, I ordered a dish Edward refused to eat, claiming he didn't like it. But as I finished, he drank up all the soup I didn't. I realized he wasn't unwilling to eat, but reluctant to spend. My eyes watered. I suggested we get another one since we could afford it. He dismissed it, saying it wasn't good, and pulled me away. Edward had a frugal upbringing, where every dollar counted, but he never stopped me from buying anything. He always felt guilty for not giving me a better life, even though he did. As the company grew profitable, he became a big shot to others, receiving all kinds of attention. But he never accepted it. What more could you ask for in a man? But how could a man, who had everything, suddenly be enchanted by a middle-aged woman covered in dark spots at 40? I sighed, opened my eyes, and looked at Edward sleeping next to me, feeling all mixed up. After a whole day of rain, there were almost no pedestrians on the road. It was already 11 o'clock at night, with a drizzle in the air, and there stood a lone figure. When she saw Edward as he opened the car door, Judy burst into tears, her tears mixing with the rain on her thin, sharp chin. Edward got out of the car and rushed over to her, worried. "What are you doing here?" he exclaimed. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't mean to disturb you, but my daughter is being bullied, and I really don't know what to do. You're the only one I know." I didn't get out of the car, just watched from a distance. Edward glanced back at me. He knew how awkward the situation was. "Why are you looking for me? What can I do?" he scolded her. "Why are you always like this, just crying? Quickly go back home, call the police, talk to the teacher. What's the use of standing out here in the rain? Who will take care of your daughter if you get sick?" All his words were reproaches, but all I heard was concern. Judy bowed her head, crying, her shoulders trembling slightly. After a while, she looked up with a bitter smile. "I'm sorry. I was just too anxious, lost my mind. Sorry to bother you." She looked at me in the car, bit her lip, a hint of resentment hidden in her eyes. "Helen, you're so lucky to have a good husband, a good family, unlike me, an unlucky person." After saying that, she turned and ran off, disappearing into the rain. Edward watched her go, and after a long while, he chuckled and said, "Nuts." He pretended as if nothing had happened, forgetting even to open the umbrella, as he walked into the neighborhood in the rain. I got out of the car and silently followed him, watching him drenching in the rain. It wasn't until we entered the house that I spoke up. "Edward, don't make a scene, Nancy is fast asleep." I was telling him not to do anything out of line. He had a perfect family, a lovely daughter. Thoughts of his past love should be left as memories. Don't lose your head and make a mistake. Edward understood the unspoken meaning behind my words. He smiled. "Don't worry." Then he turned and went into the small room next to the master bedroom. He always did this, after drinking, afraid of snoring and disturbing my sleep in the middle of the night. So he would go to the small room to sleep. But that night, I had a feeling that something bad was going to happen, and I couldn't fall asleep. It wasn't until 2 in the morning that I finally heard a faint sound coming from the next room. A few minutes later, I looked through the window and saw Edward, shrouded in darkness, leaving alone. I couldn't believe it. He was actually going to take that step. After a while, I made a phone call. "Do you remember the woman you were investigating for me last week? Go sit downstairs near her apartment. There will be a visitor tonight." I needed to have a serious talk with Edward. Our daughter was in middle school now, at the most sensitive time of adolescence. She depended a lot on Edward, and I didn't want him to keep making mistakes and causing her harm. At 40, we both had established careers, holding certain social status. I didn't want to make a scene with him. It would be too embarrassing. The next day, while our daughter was at a friend's house, I placed those photos on the table, preparing to have a candid conversation with Edward. "You followed me." He couldn't believe it. I stood with my arms crossed, leaning against the back of the sofa, quietly watching him. My husband, my daughter's father, going to another woman's house in the middle of the night. Am I not entitled to know? Edward choked up. After a while, he just said, "Her daughter was being bullied at school." I just felt sorry for the child and went to take a look. Didn't do anything. I naturally knew he didn't do anything. The private detective took photos the whole night, while Edward just sat in the living room smoking one cigarette after another. The most he did was hand Judy a piece of paper. This was also why I felt Edward could still be saved. I raised my eyebrows coldly. "Before you pity others, think about your own child. What if Helen lost her dad? What would she do?" "I understand." He took a couple of steps, then turned back, snatched the photos on the coffee table with a hint of anger, crumpling them up. "Don't do this kind of thing again," he warned, looking at me with a disgusted expression. That night when our daughter came home, she didn't notice anything amiss. Edward had cut up watermelon for her and played games with her. I sat upstairs working on my paper, occasionally looking down at the backs of father and daughter, hearing Nancy's laughter. I thought he was already sober, had withdrawn in time, and everything would be as it used to be. After a while, Edward's phone rang. He glanced at it and ignored it. Then, the ringing went off like a series of cannon blasts. Even Nancy was annoyed by the noise. Edward reluctantly picked up the phone. He looked at the messages, his eyes widening. Nancy didn't know anything and asked him, "Dad, what's wrong?" Gripping the phone, his breathing trembling, he eventually made a decision, quickly picked up his coat from the floor and headed out the door. "Nancy, Daddy needs to go out for a bit." Is he out of his mind? Has he lost it? I stood up suddenly, trying to stop him. "Edward." He just looked up, then dashed into the night without looking back. I knew our family was completely done. Nancy asked me, "Mom, where did Dad go?" How do I explain it to her? I looked at her innocent face, tried to speak several times, but held back. "Maybe he has some work stuff at the office. Don't worry, he'll be back soon," I finally managed to say. Nancy looked outside with a worried expression. "Nothing will happen, right?" "How could it?" "Go to bed now. you need to host your friends tomorrow. I want to wait for Dad to come back, Nancy said, clutching her hands. After a while, she said, okay, if Dad comes back, remember to wake me up. Nancy went upstairs worriedly to sleep, and before closing the door, I smiled at her. My husband ran away, but I could still manage a smile. I walked to the living room, sat quietly on the sofa, and lit a cigarette. My phone kept receiving videos from a private detective. Edward rushed to the hospital with Judy's daughter on his back, helping the limping Judy into the car. In the hospital corridor, two people confided in each other. I couldn't be bothered to watch anymore. I put out the cigarette, sat there motionless, waiting for daylight. The next day was Nancy's birthday, but Edward didn't come back. I didn't even bother to call him. Nancy asked me twice why Dad didn't come back, but then she stopped asking. During the party, she couldn't find anything to smile about. By 11 in the evening, Nancy was already asleep. Finally, Edward came back. I shook my glass of red wine and jokingly said, back so soon. Must have been a busy day, huh? He hesitated for a moment, knowing there wasn't much to explain at this point. So, what do you want? He asked. What do I want? It's quite funny, I replied. I couldn't resist it anymore and smashed the glass of wine on his head. You're the one who left your own daughter to take care of your ex-lover's daughter. So, what do you think I want? Edward held back, his veins bulging. We've been together since we were 16. We dated for 10 years. He exclaimed, for 10 years. She stood by me through thick and thin, and got nothing in return. Look at the life she's living now. If I didn't take care of her, would I even be a man? You two broke up a long time ago. How she's doing is none of your business, I retorted. I promised to make her life better. His voice trembled as he continued, when she slept on the streets with me. I made a promise in my heart that one day I would make her life better. But now, I live in a big mansion, with a thriving career and family, envied by everyone, yet she's washing dishes and being looked down upon. Her daughter gets bullied and she has no one to help her. How can I stand by and watch? He was emotional, but I couldn't care less about it. So, what's your plan then? I asked. He fell silent for a moment, then wiped the blood off his forehead. I came back today to tell you that, for the time being, I won't be coming home. He didn't say the word divorce, but it was pretty much what he meant. I never thought that the power of first love could be so strong. To make a man, who had been calm and collected for decades, go crazy for her. I had no feelings left for him, so I didn't care if we stayed together or not. It's just Nancy that I'm worried about. Suddenly, there was a gentle sound of a door opening upstairs. Edward and I both looked up. Nancy stood at the door, holding her teddy bear, tears streaming down her face. Nancy, I was startled. Edward hesitated for a moment, then quickly smiled and said, Nancy, did Mom and Dad disturb you? Nancy didn't say anything. He nervously took out a small gift box from his pocket and said, I'm sorry, Daddy came back late. Nancy looked at him coldly, her young face drowned in tears. You're not my dad. Go be someone else's dad, she said. Nancy. Edward rushed towards her, but Nancy locked the door and refused to open it, no matter how much he called. That night, Edward left the house. No matter how guilty he felt towards Nancy, he couldn't resist the pull of his first love. I despised Edward, but I still didn't want a divorce. 1. I didn't want to make it easy for them. 2. I was worried that a divorce would hurt Nancy. 3. I didn't want to lose to Judy. And so we remained in a cold war. A few days later, I went to the hospital to pick up my medical report. A familiar doctor stopped me. Helen. She hesitated, looking around, then asked, is your husband here? I shook my head. He didn't come with me today. Every time I have a checkup, he used to come with me. Honestly, I feel a bit awkward today. But she sighed in relief. That's good. Come with me for a moment. I was puzzled until we entered her office, and she handed me a test report. It was from last week, when Edward had a stomach ache, and I accompanied him for a checkup. I looked at the report, feeling blank. Pancreatic cancer. In the late stage. The doctor sighed. Yes, we were worried it might upset the patient, so we had to call you to come. I kept looking at the test results. Edward always had stomach pains, but refused to go to the hospital. He attributed his pains to a stomach condition from eating cold steamed buns in his youth. Last week, I forced him to the hospital for a checkup, but he didn't even bother to care about the results. He had no idea how close he was to death. I finally asked the doctor, should I tell him? She said, some patients, when they know their condition, will fight for recovery, which can help them. But sometimes, knowing the truth can worsen their condition due to emotional stress. We can't judge the patient's character, so whether or not to tell the patient usually depends on the family's decision. My advice is to gently let him know. However, before she could finish, my phone rang. It was Edward. Have you made up your mind? Let's find a time to get a divorce, he said impatiently. I wanted to light a cigarette, but then remembered I was in a hospital. So I leaned against the wall and massaged my temples. You really want to go back to her? I've made up my mind. Helen, you're 40. Life only comes around once. And I've spent half my life regretting. I don't want the second half to be even more full of regrets. I want to make it up to her. Regretting half your life. I couldn't believe it. Edward, all these years together. Have you just been pretending? He fell silent for a moment. Helen, I appreciate your dad, and I appreciate you. But I feel like I've paid off what I owe you all these years. I know you've never really liked me. So maybe it's best for both of us to go our separate ways. I was shocked. I've never liked you. Have I ever said anything like that to you all these years? When your parents were sick or passed away, I was there for you, doing everything I could. And you say I don't like you. I heard a derisive chuckle on the other end of the line. You were born a princess. No one would ever dislike you. How could you understand what that feels like? In that moment, my blood ran cold. How absurd. He used to feel inferior to me, and I was always careful not to hurt his feelings, treating him with kindness and respect. I never imagined I would still hurt his pride. All these years, he felt like he was sacrificing himself for me. But what about Nancy? She still has you, giving up everything for a first love, even his child. A fire ignited in my heart, causing me to clench the report in my hand almost to shreds. I used to pity him, but now, I took a deep breath, released my grip, and spoke again. Divorce is fine. You leave with nothing. And you need to repay me for all the money you've spent on Judy these past few days. Okay. To my surprise, he agreed without hesitation, saying, as long as you're willing to divorce, anything is fine. It was too ridiculous, so absurd that I couldn't help but laugh. Edward, what are you really after? Love. From age 16 to 26, sleeping on the streets, dreaming of a future together. You wouldn't understand. How touching. To hold on to a love for over a decade, willing to give up everything. If I weren't his wife, how heartwarming this story would be. Back in the doctor's office, I had regained my composure. Doctor, what were you about to say earlier? She looked up. I was going to say, your husband's illness can't be postponed any longer. It needs to be treated as soon as possible. If you delay any longer, he'll probably only have half a year left to live. I nodded, holding back a couple of tears. I understand. I will take him to the best hospital, and I will make sure he gets better. Leaving the hospital, I hid the report, pretending nothing had happened. Cancer? Who has cancer? I have no idea. Everything was arranged. The only thing I didn't know how to face was Nancy. When I got home in the evening, Nancy was sitting on the couch watching TV. The empty living room, with her sitting there alone, as quiet as a doll. She didn't turn around to look at me, and I didn't call out to her. We just stood there, stiffly. Finally, she turned back, tears streaming down her face. Mom, are you and Dad really getting a divorce? My heart feels like it's breaking. She had been silently grieving for these days, reluctant to face it, until today, when she finally dared to confirm it with me. I rushed over and hugged her. I'm sorry, Nancy. She cried for a long time, then shook her head. It's okay, Mom. You know, at school, I've always been proud, not because we're rich, but because my dad has always been so good to my mom. I like my dad, because he loves my mom, just like I do. If he doesn't love my mom anymore, then I won't either. Her face was still young, but her eyes were cold, having lost her previous innocence. I felt comforted yet heartbroken. When Edward and I got divorced, Judy was there too, with the daughter who looked so much like her. She had been scheming behind Edward's back these days, and today was our first face-to-face confrontation. Perhaps to boost her spirits, or to celebrate our divorce and assert her dominance, she deliberately wore a red coat. But it had the opposite effect, making her look garish and tacky. But some people like that. Edward noticed me looking at her, and stood in front of me, as if he was facing a formidable foe. Helen, I insisted on the divorce, so come after me with anything. I almost rolled my eyes. He was delusional to think that way. She wasn't even worth my time. I walked into the Civil Affairs Bureau carrying my bag, and Edward breathed a sigh of relief, following me inside. The divorce procedures were done in an orderly manner. As we were about to embark on our new lives, he couldn't hide his excitement. After receiving the divorce certificate, he turned around and smiled at Judy. I looked down, carefully studying our photo. For a moment, I remembered how happy we were when we got married. It had been 14 years in the blink of an eye. It really made one reflect. Edward, I called out to him. He turned around, thinking I was going to make things difficult for him, looking tense. I've left with nothing. What more do you want? I just wanted to say that I hoped he wouldn't regret it. But seeing how eager he was to cut ties with me now, there was no need. So I just smiled and said, I wish you both happiness. Enjoy your remaining, brief life to the fullest. A tinge of red appeared in the corner of my eye. No woman can tolerate her husband being alone with his ex-wife. Judy walked up holding her daughter's hand. Edward, she took hold of his arm, quietly breaking the stalemate. What were you two talking about? She looked at me, smiling but not smiling. I simply said, nothing much. I was just wondering when you two were planning to have the wedding. Soon. I wanted to take it slow, but Edward has been pushing, afraid I might run away. She smiled happily, looking at me, subtly raising her eyebrow. Helen, thank you for giving me back such a good Edward. That smile of victory was bland, but full of aggression. She had spent a lot of effort to reach this moment, calculating every seemingly casual word and action she used to get close to Edward. Now that she had achieved her goal, she must be feeling quite pleased. I didn't say anything, just looked at Edward carefully. This was the first time in a long time that I had really looked at him. He looked a little thin, with a slight yellowish complexion, and his hair was neatly combed, but somehow exuded a sense of fatigue. Most people would think he was just tired, but only I knew the real reason. I averted my gaze and looked at Judy, gently reminding her, he has a stomach problem, remember to have painkillers ready at home. To her, I was just a pitiful creature, who had been abandoned, but still unwilling to let go. And her lover completely stood by her side. This intensified her sense of triumph. So, she smirked, feeling victorious. Don't worry, I understand Edward better than you do. Goodbye, Helen. You must come when Edward and I get married, she said as she proudly walked away with Edward, like a proud swan holding her head high. Once outside, Judy's daughter cheerfully asked Edward, Edward, can I call you Dad from now on? Edward smiled and said, of course. The little girl was overjoyed. Yay! I have a dad now. They won't dare bully me again. Hand in hand, they got into the car. Watching their backs, it looked like a happy family of three. Unfortunately, no matter how happy they were now, they would face an equal amount of breakdown in the future. Silently, I put the divorce certificate in my bag and walked out of the Civil Affairs Bureau. In the glaring sunlight, I saw a slim figure. Nancy. At this time, she should be playing at a friend's house. She came at some point, and I didn't know how long she had been there. Pausing for a moment, she walked over and her cold little hand held mine. Mom, I'm here to take you home. From now on, I'll protect you, okay? Feeling a mix of emotions, my nose suddenly felt sour. I tried to hold back the tears and nodded, okay. Mom, don't cry. You have Nancy. Mom doesn't cry. Before getting into the car, Nancy glanced in the direction where Edward had disappeared, her expression indifferent, as if that person had nothing to do with her anymore. She had grown up overnight and would never get hurt again. After divorcing Edward, he started a new company. He had capabilities, connections, and the certainty of making a comeback. That's why he dared to start over from scratch. Half of the old company's staff were poached by him, and he also brought over a lot of business. He took out a loan, and soon the new company was up and running smoothly. Judy became the vice president of the new company, even though she knew nothing about the company's operations, but because Edward doted on her. On the day of the ribbon cutting, she stood by Edward's side in a new suit, looking a bit like a successful professional. Edward and I hadn't unfriended each other on social media, and she knew I would come across Edward's posts. So almost every day, she would post something visible only to me. Like how Edward would only act like a child when he was with her. Something I had never seen in him. For example, posting a picture of a positive pregnancy test. I never thought Edward was still capable. At 40, he was still able to have a child. Did Edward not know what Judy was doing every day? No, he knew very well, but he felt he owed her 14 years. So no matter what she did, he indulged her. I was just a part of their circle. A month later, I received their wedding invitation. Judy called me herself to share the good news. Edward said that after the wedding, they would go on a honeymoon. He wanted to go see the snow-capped mountains in Switzerland, the sea in Sonia, and ride a hot air balloon in Turkey. I was sure she knew that when Edward and I got married, he didn't go on a honeymoon with me because he was too busy with work. That's why she called just to boast. But she didn't know that the building was about to collapse. I listened quietly, and in a brief pause, I asked her, do you need a wedding dress? The one I wore when I married Edward is still there. Cost $800,000. It's really beautiful. Haven't worn such an expensive dress. Want to borrow it? She hung up the phone. Someone asked me why I wasn't angry at the provocation from Edward and Judy. They sympathized with my misfortune and wondered why I didn't retaliate, even offering to help bring down Edward's new company. I just smiled calmly and said, no need. The higher they fly, the happier I am. A few days later, Edward and Judy held their wedding by the beach. I attended quietly, all bundled up. The wedding was set up on the most beautiful beach, and the scene was dreamy, with a lot of thought put into everything from the decorations to the tableware. Among the guests, aside from some familiar faces, there were also some of Judy's less affluent relatives. They were invited by Judy to witness her dream wedding. Judy wore an elaborate wedding dress, holding her head high, leading her daughter, waiting in the flower room to make an entrance. As the music played, the ceremony was about to begin. I found a waiter and asked him to do something for me. After being tipped, the waiter ran eagerly toward backstage and handed a sealed envelope to Edward, who was waiting. By then, the host had already taken the stage, and the groom was about to make his entrance. Edward took the envelope and impatiently asked something. The waiter just shook his head and walked away, so he had to tear open the envelope and quickly glance at its contents. Soon, his gaze was fixed. Uncertain and trembling, he checked repeatedly, his hand shaking so violently that he could hardly hold a piece of paper. On stage, the host called Edward's name, but he seemed oblivious. After 3 times, the guests below began to stir, looking in the direction where the groom was expected to appear. Judy, in the flower room, also started to get anxious, peering out through the door crack. Edward looked up, his face pale, scanning the surroundings until he spotted me. I stood at a distance, holding a champagne glass, smiling, raising a toast to him from afar. Edward and Judy's century wedding turned into a century farce. He rushed towards me, asking why I was so vicious. I just patted his face. If you have time to come after me, you might as well hurry to the hospital for a checkup. Maybe there's still a chance. He fainted in anger and was hastily taken to the hospital. Judy had lost a high-heel shoe, her makeup was smudged, and she was as dirty as if she had rolled in a garbage can. As I left in the car, she clung to the door, frantically smashing the glass with her bare hands. How could you be so cruel? This was my dream wedding. You've ruined everything. I'm going to kill you. She was like a mad dog, almost uncontrollable. Instead of going crazy here, why don't you go check on your husband right away? I shook my head in pity and signaled for the driver to leave. Judy kept screaming from behind, Helen, you wait. I won't let you get away with this. I gestured for the driver to pause momentarily. Then, I looked at the helpless girl in the distance, crying. Your daughter is about to start middle school, right? I asked. Judy paused, her eyes filled with shock and confusion. She's very kind, very innocent, you've protected her well. I took out a disgraceful photo from my bag, looking at her, and said with a smirk, imagine if all her classmates knew that her mother is the third party wrecking someone else's family. What would happen? Oh dear, wouldn't she be bullied again? I heard she was bullied badly at her previous school. Helen, she's innocent. She trembled, almost inaudibly. She's innocent, but who made her your daughter? If you dare to interfere again, wherever your daughter goes, I'll spread these photos, and believe me, what I say, I do. Judy trembled all over, crying uncontrollably. You're so cruel. Are you even human? Cruel. Compared to the harm you've done to my daughter, I've been quite merciful. I turned away without looking at her. The driver understood and drove off. In the rearview mirror, Judy collapsed in a cloud of dust. Edward was rushed to the nearest hospital that day, and that night, he flew back overnight for further medical checks at the best hospital. The results are unnecessary to mention. In the first 2 months, in order to let Judy have a good life, he worked tirelessly day and night, taking painkillers when he felt unwell, repeatedly delaying his illness. By now, the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. At the wedding, he suddenly found out he had cancer. The mental breakdown triggered further deterioration of his condition, and within a week, he was unable to care for himself. The news of Edward's serious illness spread quickly. The new company he had just managed to set up was on the brink of collapse overnight, and those employees he had poached had all scattered like birds. A few days later, I took people to his company to move the equipment. When Judy found out, she hurried over to stop me. I pulled out the promissory note Edward had written to me before the divorce. Don't you know, Edward promised before the divorce to return all the money he spent on you during the marriage to me. Now that he is on his deathbed and can't pay up, I can only move some equipment to make up for my losses. Besides, you're not married to Edward. His assets have nothing to do with you. You have no right to stop me. She sat on the ground, going crazy. I have his child in my belly. These are all partly ours. I don't agree. You can't move. But the workers paid no attention to her and quickly cleared out the equipment. Before leaving, I casually reminded her, forgot to mention, the house Edward bought for you was mortgaged when he started the company. If you don't run now, wait to be hounded by debt collectors. 2 weeks later, I went to see Edward again. He had lost a lot of weight, but was actively cooperating with treatment, fighting cancer hard. When he saw me, he had no resentment, just a defiant spirit. Are you here to see me fail? You might be disappointed. I won't die like this. I will get better, and go on a honeymoon with Judy. watch our child being born and growing up. I looked at him with pity. But Judy has already had the child aborted. He froze, unbelieving. You're talking nonsense. How could Judy have aborted our child? What nonsense do I have? I said with a smile. My people saw her go for surgery last night, and this morning, she had already run away with our daughter. It's impossible. Judy wouldn't do such a thing. She wouldn't. She said she would always be with me. He trembled, pulled out his phone, and called Judy. It kept going to voicemail. He didn't believe it, dialing and messaging repeatedly, until finally, his hope sank, sitting on the ground, crying in silence. I shook my head, turned and left. The next news from Edward came a month later. He was reduced to skin and bones. He called me and said he wanted to see Nancy. In his lonely and desperate time, he finally started to repent, seeking forgiveness. But Nancy didn't want to see him. She was leisurely digging for crabs at the beach, indifferent. Doesn't he have a daughter? Go find her instead. Why come to me? Edward on the other end of the phone wept uncontrollably. 3 days later, he passed away in the hospital, with no one by his side. And my daughter and I were flying to the next destination, the future shining as bright as the sun.